been a pretty squeaky clean player. In fact, I can't really think of any time a controversy has ever really happened around you, Broxah, outside of very, in my opinion, unjustified flame from the audience. But like,
didn't you punch Reckless once,
Yeah,
Broxah? I'm sure I missed this on the
that's the
start.
one that came to my mind as well, the Broxah Reckless fight.
Hello and welcome to Recall, a bi-weekly competitive League of Legends podcast that covers all of the most important matches of the global League of Legends scene. This episode we're going to be focusing primarily on the West, and I'm joined, of course, by Broxah and Medic. How are you guys?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, doing well. Finally get a little bit of break from League of Legends for a while, which is always nice in the middle of the season.
And then you're like, but now come on and talk about more League of Legends.
Exactly.
He's done shouting, being a caster now. He can just chill, relax.
Calm. Yeah.
We, right before this episode went live, we actually got to see your cats viciously attack you.
Yep.
I'm hoping that the cats will make a reappearance for this episode. If you have one, please, I have to have the cat tax. Please hold it up to the camera.
Yeah, so Mika will let me hold her up, and if she arrives, I will definitely demonstrate her existence to you all. But if Kiki comes along, I like my face without scratches, so I'll probably leave her to sort of work her own way into the picture.
Broxah, do you pay the cat tax? Do you have any animals nearby?
Unfortunately, that's not the case now, so Medic will have to do the job for the two of us.
Okay, fair. Outside of that, it's like generalized icebreakers before we get into it. How is everyone doing? Medic, we talked about how crazy the schedule has been for the LEC. You want a little bit of a break. Broxah, you actually just on the LEC broadcast, assisting them running into playoffs. It's probably been a whirlwind, but how are you guys feeling right now? Don't all go at once.
I kind of already said how I was feeling, so I was going to let Broxah take it away.
Well, no, I feel good. The last weeks have been pretty interesting for me, the last months in general. Now, full-time streaming, just chilling here in Denmark for a while, obviously. Going to Berlin was interesting in a lot of ways, because I've been at the studio, met both of you there many times, but I was kind of on the other side, being a player, and now got to see what's happening behind the scenes, all of a sudden having to talk about all the games and players and stuff, and that was really interesting, a bit weird as well, I gotta admit, but it was a cool experience.
I love this conversation. Can I ask you questions about it? Because I've always wanted to pick a player's brain about it.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so was it as easy or as difficult as you thought it would be, and what were the biggest things you needed to focus on a broadcast? Let's start with, was it easy or was it hard?
So I think the analysis part of it was easier than I expected it to be, because normally when you're on a team site and you talk about a game, you talk about what's happening in the game for 30-40 minutes sometimes, and you just need to be ready to really hyper analyze everything. But in this case, when you're on the analyst desk, you mostly get to talk about 2-ish points, and it has to be so quick and efficient. I know in this case, when I was there, Shox was the host, and once I had already talked for 20 seconds, she starts looking me in the eye and basically tells me that I need to finish up and move on. So in that sense, it was a bit different than I expected it to, that you get you have a couple of points you want to talk about, but you can move over them rather quickly, and you don't need to go that in-depth like you would when you're talking to your teammates. Also because you need to analyze and all, but it also needs to be easy for the viewers on the other side to understand, right? But then there was one thing that surprised me. So I would say the analysis part was a bit easier than perhaps I expected it to. But then I also had to be at the studio a lot longer than I had expected, because normally when you're a player, you just show up at the studio an hour before your game, you play your game, and then you go home. So you're there for 2 hours. But apparently when you're an analyst, you show up around lunchtime, and then you get to go home
Never.
11 p.m. around midnight, and I was really surprised when I saw the schedule. At first I was like, wait, what am I gonna do at the studio that long? But then it's because there's rehearsal and you do styling, like you get fancy clothes. That was also a new experience, but there was a lot more things going on, right? Obviously, a lot more games that you have to take part into.
In terms of kind of like the day-to-day or going through it, was there anything that you particularly found really fun? Is there anything that you wish that you could like change about the broadcast structure? Because I love that you brought up one of the primary issues of being an analyst on the analyst desk is the time constraints and the viewership vocabulary or the audience vocabulary of trying to explain something very quickly and concisely without having the time to go in depth, or b the shared vocabulary to make sure that like a wide variety of the audience at least understand what you're talking about. How would you address this issue, or do you think this issue needs to be addressed at all?
I'm not sure what the best way to approach it would be, especially because obviously you cannot drag out the conversations for too long, because what the viewers care the most about is the games.
The game starting.
But at the same time, it is kind of tricky because I feel like for every game I had like so many things I wanted to talk about, and I could talk about them for so long. But then usually we would have maybe 5 minutes in total where it's not only me talking, that's shared with Shocks and Nymera, the other analyst as well. And then all of a sudden, all these great thoughts that you made while watching the game and these things you want to talk about, you actually only get to talk about a fraction of it. And I don't really know if there's a way to fix that, because obviously everything needs to run smoothly, otherwise it can drag out big time. But I'm not gonna lie, I wouldn't have minded a big pause at some point, just to get time to share all my great thoughts and everything.
Yeah, but here's the thing, Broxah. Like, as soon as you have a pause like that, all that's happening is chat is spamming. Casters, please start game. Analysts, please start game. They're not actually listening to what you're saying 90% of the time. They're just like, hey, we just want to watch League of Legends as much as we can. So it is like, sure. It's definitely a limited space to analyze. I think what LCS did actually with Hai and Blabber was really cool, where they had Hai talking with Blabber. I think it was about some of his early jungle pathing, and they actually like went through segments. It. Yeah, it was really cool. And telestrator segments, as you say, Frosk in general, are really strong for showing those more nuanced bits of analysis.
I know you guys are. Oh, sorry, Broxah.
There was one thing I thought of when I was traveling home, actually, that I thought in hindsight would have been really cool. But I think the segment with Hai is like kind of close to it, but where like kind of doing an interview with a player or getting to talk to a player on broadcast, I think would be interesting, because I talked to Caps at one point, like alongside Chucks, and I thought that was pretty cool, because obviously we know each other pretty well from the past, and there's like different stories and things you can talk about that are obviously game related, but not only. And I think just taking like that approach and really getting to pick a player's brain when you have like a player to player conversation, I think could create a lot of interesting just conversations and scenarios.
It's always so interesting about how to like best package content around the broadcast. I think that's why having the players come onto the cast has always been so successful. When we've had, I think, Kadrill very famously, before becoming an actual LEC caster, pulling onto the broadcast. And I know there's always opportunities that we look for during that. Obviously, Broxah, you were highlighted very early on as like, this is a player who we think will do really well on broadcast because you're eloquent, you can present yourself, you're clear and easy to understand. And I think that there's a little bit of a gap in the audience understanding that not every player can be super well suited for that. But I just want to assure everyone in the audience that the LEC, LCS broadcasts are constantly looking for opportunities to get the players on in every single capacity. And I always find it very interesting that the narrative is shifted as like broadcast versus the players sometimes, especially when some sort of controversy happens. As a player, can you speak to any of that? Like, I know that you've been a pretty squeaky clean player. In fact, I can't really think of any time a controversy has ever really happened around you, Broxah, outside of very, in my opinion, unjustified flame from the audience. But like,
didn't you punch Reckless once,
Yeah,
Broxah?
that's the one that came to my mind as well, the Broxah Reckless fight.
No, but like, how do you feel? Do you feel... Do pro players even listen to the broadcast?
Well, if I am to be completely honest, then I think it really depends on um, the players and coaches on specific teams. Because I've been on teams where um, I've been on teams where we play with, or we watch the broadcast muted, and where we watch with like casters and analysis. I think it just really depends, to be honest. But when it comes to your previous point about players and being on broadcast and everything, I think there's no doubt that not everyone would be able to do it. It was also pretty nerve-wracking for me, and I think there was a lot of things I could improve on. But the thing is that when you're a player, and especially when everything is new for you, like I still remember sitting on stage for the first time and like thinking about how many people are watching, and then when you do an interview and you have to talk and in front of so many people, that's really nerve-wracking as well. And a lot of players are just not that interested in being on camera. They kind of prefer taking more of a background role, and often on the teams I've been on, a lot of players were trying to avoid interviews or broadcast related things whenever they could. Of course, there's exceptions to that, but just generally speaking, because it's not really their top priority, or they have other things they would rather do or focus on for different reasons, I guess.
Is there anything that you want to like kind of close out before we move on to actually talking about the leagues?
Well, I guess
cat action.
Yeah, I was about to say, I guess the cat tax is about to be paid, so that's a pretty good final point in this regard.
It's like 10 minutes ago she's biting me, and now she's just like, oh yeah, I will deign to let you touch me. So
it's because the camera's on. Now she has to like
Exactly.
be in performance mode.
Yeah.
Okay, kind of now moving away from. Sorry, I find those topics very interesting, especially because I think as the curtain gets pulled back on like broadcast, because it's like this black box that no one can really from the audience get into, and even the broadcasts themselves really struggles like getting inside like the team's atmosphere, the players' atmosphere, how these two components are working together, and how we kind of build a product for an audience around this. But going to the state of the leagues, I wanted to kind of pick your guys' brain about the current meta. And if you could just like simplify for me, an idiot, what is the best way to play a League of Legends, and is that defining the best teams right now? Like, are the best teams in the league because they're playing the game to like the utmost perfect way, or are they the best teams simply because their players are just brute forcing victories and they're actually going against meta trends?
I think it's always generally quite hard to tell if people are playing League perfectly, because at least a few years ago we'd say, oh, you watch Korea, that's perfect League of Legends. This is macro enacted to the highest degree. The mechanics are really strong. You do this, you will win the game 10 times out of 10. Whereas as soon as LPL started rising up and started, beating everyone by just taking every single fight they could see around every single objective they could see, now perfect League of Legends is a little bit more spurious. I definitely think there's a draft that we tend to see, which is, strong solo laner / split pusher in the top lane, jungler that can gank but doesn't always have to gank in the first 6 levels, mid laner, mage, pick someone that can either roam or someone that can just farm and have zone control late game, and then either Jinx or Aphelios as an AD carry, and either an enchanter or an engager in the bottom lane. Usually engagers, mostly because the top laners aren't there in the fight, so you want to support that can go
Medic, because this is what you just said. There are 2 options basically on like the spectrum of things. You're like, well, it's either an enchanter or it's a tank. It's either a split pusher or it's a dude who could team fight. It's either someone who could roam or someone who could sit and farm. I'm like, these are supposed to be mutually exclusive, but it just sounds like you just name champions that could basically do everything.
They just do everything. That's kind of the problem with the meta. It's like, what do you do on Rise? Well, I have great team control. I'm really tanky. I can wave clear really well. Oh, also my ultimate means I can make it a 4v2 bot lane at 10 minutes. So what's like, you don't have to really sacrifice anything in League right now to be able to have a comp that works, at least with the style of League that we have at the moment in LEC and across most regions. So.
Broxah, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I think I think Medic's read on this is pretty spot on. I think there's a lot of prior picks right now more than anything, but those prior picks bring very different play styles, and I think it just makes the game pretty interesting, where each team has like some picks that they prefer more than others. Some prefer split push, some prefer team fighting. I think the only role that doesn't have some sort of flexibility really is the AD carry, because AD carry is just Jinx or Aphelios every game, which is pretty crazy to think about that it's actually been like that for a few weeks. But outside of that, I think you have a lot of options. Now, generally, if you look at the different major regions, most of them have 3-4 champions that are by far the most played in every role. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean there's one preferred playstyle, and the game is just so chaotic now compared to what it was in the past. Like, I clearly remember when I started as a pro player, there was always a simple way to play the game, and it was so easy to notice when you made a mistake, because it was a good old Korean style in Season 7 where you play really slow. It's all about macro, not a lot of kills or craziness compared to now. But now it's just chaos all over, and the games are so volatile and unstable. And I think in the end, whoever wins just comes down to a mix of like team play, but just as much individual skill.
In terms of,
sorry, do you mind if I just try and can I challenge you a bit on that thought, Broxah? Just about like how you. I look at draft at the moment, and although there are like picks that do slightly different things, to me at least the game plays out relatively similarly, at least at pro level. Like in solo queue, I think it's a bit different. There are a lot of picks that can be very strong in solo queue, but most games, even if you want to pick someone that can split push, like if I pick Graves top and build Hullbreaker, at least up until I haven't looked at 12.5 that much because I haven't seen any like pro play on it, but at least up until 12.4. I could pick Graves. I could either split push or team fight if I needed to, just because the item's in such a good position. I could pick Gwen and do a similar thing. I could pick Gnar and do a similar thing. I could pick Camille and do a similar thing. Mid lane, I'd pick Ryze, TF, maybe Corki if I was feeling a little spicy or feeling like I hadn't really adapted my champion pool since 12.2. And those do the same thing as well. You have roam potential, strong team fights, and zone control. Victor as well. Doesn't roam as much, but still team fight control. Both of the AD carries do the same thing. Aphelios slightly stronger in the early game, but in terms of win-loss, like Jinx is just overall the best AD carry. And then the majority of the time, the only real difference you see is, does your jungler really want to heavily gank early on in the game, or do they want to shadow your lanes to make sure that your lanes don't get heavily ganked in the early game? We're not seeing the old school power farming junglers, the Graves, even the Lilia to a degree that we saw back in patch 11. So although I think there is some champion diversity, even there I'm not sure how much champion diversity there is, I actually think the game plays very similarly, at least in the regions that I have my eye on most of the time. Now LCK and LPL, I know there are a few changes there, but I still think the majority of games actually feel very similar to me.
If I'm understanding this correctly, you mentioned itemization, the Hullbreaker. I would assume that meta would be defined by who can itemize what, and what item is just going to be mathematically either busted or too strong right now. And then I think something really interesting is that we tend to put these things in like very generalized buckets about, these champions all do kind of the same thing, which I agree with you, Medic, is like when we look at a Ryze versus a Victor, you're like, well, you have great like AoE control in front of you, just because both of them can do pretty massive upfront damage to a lot of zone control. But I don't think that we pay enough attention to kind of the specific differences of those champions, about certain matchups or trade patterns or breakpoints, or even the specific intimate details and differences in team fights. And it sounds like when we're, praising as Brox is talking about priority picks for different players in different teams, it's usually going to be because a player has a very specific mentality on a champion, really understands when their matchups are, the intimate details there, and how to over execute on those champions, even though they fit in those generalized, very specific buckets. Like, oh, it's Ryze or Victor. It's going to be a control mage, if you will, in the mid lane. But I always find it really interesting when the broadcast, or kind of the vocabulary of the audience kind of has to move the chains, if you will. It's kind of like, a new thing comes out, we catch up everyone on that, but then there has to be like another evolution point where we move the chains again and we start talking again like, okay, the big difference between a Rise and a Victor is at this level, and this level. You know, when he has this item versus this item, he can now do this versus this. And I think that's what we need to hone in a little bit more on and kind of get the audience up to speed so we can really start appreciating what players are doing with these specific champions and why one team comp versus another team comp can be seen as like different. It's like really specifying win conditions, but obviously that's really difficult to do when you have 5 games on your docket that you're going to be casting and you're prepping for 10 different teams and the patches are constantly changing. Are the current top teams in your guys' perspective in both LEC and LCS, but we can lean more on LEC for comfort and discussion. Are these teams that coordinate well in late game? Is it just you must be a good late game team to be successful and that's why you're at the top? Or is there any outliers that are these fast-paced, early game oriented snowball teams? Like gun to your head, top team in LEC, go.
Fnatic.
Yeah, Fnatic for sure. I think in LEC, Fnatic is the most well-rounded team in the sense that their early game for the most part is really stable. They play pretty fast-paced and they just control the entire game, on macro you, and eventually, you know, come out on top. Like they're really good at just not giving the opponent a chance to breathe when they get ahead, which they often do. Whereas some of the other top teams, you know, their early game is a little less stable, but usually, oftentimes they manage to stall out the game and then they win in the late game by punishing the opponent's mistakes or by just scaling up and eventually being a very mentally strong and better team. Misfits.
I break some of these terms a little bit. So when you say stable, is this doesn't int in lane with a careless mistake, or is this a macro problem? When we say like a team is stable or not stable, do you think this is a responsibility on jungle pathing, on individual laning mechanics, on Drake setups, or is this just someone's like, I can take this trade and just ints it?
Well, I guess it could be any of those cases, really. I mean, I guess when I think it, when I think a team is not stable, it's just, I mean, just inconsistencies throughout the early game, in some cases even throughout the mid game. I know in periods while I was on Fnatic, like in some periods our early game was great, in others we often lost the early game and things fell apart, but then we won in the late game anyways because we just stalled out and we were able to out macro them and win because we were a better team. And I think in some cases that's kind of what has happened to some of the other top teams. Honestly, I think one of the best early game teams outside of Fnatic, the split, has been Mad Lions in the LEC, which a lot of people don't really think about. But Mad Lions with Elioya and Kaiser, I think, have actually been really good in the early game. But then everything just falls apart in the mid game and, you know, they end up looking pretty weak in the end. But I don't think there's really many teams outside of Fnatic that is well-rounded and that can just play really well throughout the entire game. Most of the other teams have like certain weaknesses that usually get punished.
As far as a front runner for MSI and playoffs, Medic, are you also on the Fnatic hype train?
Oh, definitely. I think, as Broxah said, they're the only team that I'd look at every portion of the game and say they're really strong. I think you can say Misfits, their late game is incredible, and I assume that's what Broxah was talking about when he said they're resilient mentally as well. Because to come back from a 13.5k gold lead as gold deficit is just absurd to me. Rogue are okay in the early game, but really accelerate between like 15 to 25 minutes, and that's where they start to out macro their opponents and outplay their opponents. And then G2 is a bit of a wild card from time to time. You don't really know exactly what you're going to get with them. I think Jankos has been unsung for that team this split. He's not the most explosive of junglers, at least in 2022, but he is very good at reading where his opponent's going to be in shadowing lanes, which is something I've noticed a lot more from him this year than perhaps in years past. Much more about just like making sure his lane doesn't die rather than making sure that they get kills on their opponents. But I think, sorry, I was just going to back up on the Fnatic point. I think the issue for me with Fnatic are like they're obviously the best team in our league, but I don't know how well their early game will translate against other teams. Because something they do very well is shut their opponents out of the game, like Broxah said. I don't know if you play T1 at MSI, do you shut Gumayushi out of lane? Like, I'm not sure even Upset and Hillisang can do that. Can you shut down Faker in the mid lane? Can you stop them from getting into their own jungle? Can you stop them from making cross-map plays? And that's why I worry that early game isn't actually as impactful in the long term unless you can really just wrest the game out of someone else's hands.
I actually
rather fight them as opposed to just like letting them get their leads and then trying to like flip a coin in late game.
I mean, it's definitely a possibility. It's just it comes back to the scaling discussion we had with bounties and such. Do you want to play a comp that will automatically win in a I have one item, you have 3/4 of an item fight in the early game? Or are you going to say, well, we can get to 3 items before you get to 3, we'll fight you at that point? Because if you take a fight with, I know you're playing Draven in the bottom lane, Draven Pike or something really aggressive, Draven Leona in the bot lane, you take a fight and you don't win that fight because the enemy jungler's there, what are you going to do for the rest of the game? When you get to 2 items, do you think Draven's going to beat Jinx? Probably not, unless you really outplay your opponent. So isn't it better to take the Aphelios Jinx handshake or the Zeri Jinx handshake and say, okay, we're not going to really force too hard on you. Maybe we shut you out of some gold in the early game. Maybe we get, 2-3k ahead. And then we take a team fight around these Drakes that we can stack or around, an inhibitor that we can fight for and just really force you to take a fight on our terms later in the game rather than risking losing a fight early on and having the game taken away from us.
Broxah?
Well, to get back to the Fnatic point and how well they would be able to do internationally, I think my main worry for Fnatic currently probably would be the fact that it feels like they're kind of leaving Wonder on an island the entire game. It's like there's like the 4 players on bot side and then there's Wonder, and Wonder is just left completely alone top almost the entire game and just has to handle himself. And that has worked well for them in the LEC because Wonder is so much better than most of the other LEC top laners, to be honest. But
Remember when everyone was trashing Wonder just like a year ago?
Oh man, that guy got scapegoated so hard.
Well, good. I feel like all those story lanes just tend to spiral out of control in general. It often happens, right? But I think I'm happy to see that Wonder has been playing well. I think if he was given a bit more attention, he would be way more of a threat and he would be able to really carry. He kind of reminds me of how Impact used to be back in the day, where you just leave him alone and he just kind of outplays and does fine. But the thing is, when you go up against the best team from Korea and China, and they send their jungler top, and all of a sudden Wonder actually has more of a challenge in the 1v1, then I think Fnatic might start having some issues unless they get... I don't really know if it's like a synergy problem between like Wonder, Razork and Humanoid, or if it's just an active choice that they have made. It could be either, but that would probably be my biggest worry for them, to be honest.
Now, turning our eyes on G2 versus Fnatic, obviously we feel that Fnatic are heavy favorites. If you guys are on the other side of this conversation and G2 have won, what happened?
Fnatic pause hack. PC's disconnected. 7,000 IQ. G2 paid their internet bills.
Is there any world? Because we said that they were the dark horse, and obviously a lot of that faith is going to Jankos and Caps, and obviously the longevity of their careers behind them and their ability to pop off. But is it anything other than the Jankos and Caps factor? Do you think that there's a specific strategy that they could exploit?
I think personally, the way G2 would beat Fnatic would be Flaget and Takamas being able to hold their own in the 2v2 against Upset and Huli, which I think is going to be tricky, but it's a possibility.
Like a lane dynamic that you think would be able to counter that out?
Not necessarily.
The old Ezreal, Tom, Kench.
But that's the thing, I feel like bot lane is just... Because of the AD pool just mostly being 2 champions, I feel like you're left with like so little options.
But we did see, sorry, just quickly, 12.5B, I think there were Jinx nerfs, so it's possible she falls down the list. And I wonder, we saw Flacker play Karthus. They had like a Karthus Seraphine lane or something at the start of the year. So maybe you could go AP plus AD mid, and that could work. You just play like a Seraphine Sona lane, or you play a Karthus or a Ziggs bot, and then Flakked is just sitting there farming from a mile away. Hylissang's unleashed on the map, yes, but you have neutralized the 2v2 bot lane. That's the only way I really see that lane staying stable, at least.
Yeah,
You think so?
bot lane.
I would be worried about letting Hyli roam around the map.
I mean, yeah, sure, but the 2v2 is stable. It's just Hyli is now in every other lane, right?
For sure. I think a wild card for G2 could be Broken Blade, because I think Broken Blade has had moments where he has really just went crazy in top lane and just really carried. And Wanda is not going to be the easiest top laner to crack, but I think if Broken Blade has a good day, he could easily be like a super carry in the top lane and take over. Obviously, like Jankos and Caps are gonna be really important in the 2v2. I think they definitely have what it takes to get an edge on Humanoid and Razork. But yeah, a mix of bot lane finding a way to be stable, whether it's by standard play or some interesting unexpected strategies that they could easily go for, and then Broken Blade just taking over top lane.
Would you put the percentage on how likely it is that we see a G2 victory here in this best of 5?
I'm gonna be honest, I did say they're my second favorite, but I'm gonna give them 25%.
Yeah, I was looking around that, like 10 to 30, so we'll go 20, I guess. The only reason I think I'm giving them that high odds is either they learn something really cool in the next 2 weeks, or they really level up in the next 2 weeks, or it's just the history, dynasty, legacy, kings. G2 Fnatic, you actually never know where it's going to go, but yeah, I'm very Fnatic biased on this one.
That's fair. Okay, so moving slightly away from the LEC towards the LCS. Again, I don't want anyone to overstretch themselves here or pull something. The conversation is really around C9 and TL in particular as kind of the two front runners. Do you guys have any strong feelings on which way you lean? Obviously, the LCS isn't ready for playoffs just yet for the LEC, so a bit of a different landscape when you're just taking in best of ones and you haven't seen the entire split. But yes, no, maybe you guys are FlyQuest fans. I don't know.
Not anymore. Not after they started losing again. I think I lean liquid-sided. I think overall they've shown me more as a team than C9 have. I actually think Fudge he's a serviceable mid laner, up to good, but I really think that when you compare him with someone like Bjergsen, even though Bjergsen hasn't been as dominant in lane as he used to be, I think Bjergsen takes that most of the time. The thing with C9 is I was very excited for some of the more eclectic drafts. I thought maybe they were bringing something new. Maybe they're going to actually, change the meta a little bit in NA. And now that they've really resorted to standard, yes, they're very good mechanical players. But I look at the Team Liquid lineup and how they play as a cohesive unit, and just think that they seem stronger generally. I would like to see more of Hansam and CoreJJ together, but knowing them both individually, I have no doubt that that's going to be a very strong bot lane.
I think Team Liquid is really interesting because the Team Liquid lineup.
You have to say good things, right? Because you're their streamer. That's the
yeah,
rule.
but
it's a bit difficult for Broxah here.
Yeah, I need to. I'll try to remain objective and unbiased, but still talk nicely about them, so Steve doesn't, get in my DMs after this. Yeah, exactly. No, but I think TL is really interesting because I feel like TL has gone through a lot of different roster iterations throughout the past couple of years, and I think the playstyle and how I look at them has always been like kind of similar. It has changed a little bit after Doublelift left, because with Doublelift it was a bit more bot lane centered, and then when Tactical came in, the playstyle changed a bit. But when I think TL the past 5 years, including the lineup that I was on, I think smart macro play and a team where it's really hard to shut them down early game because everyone just plays really stable. No one does anything crazy or makes like big mistakes. I think bringing in Hansama and Bwibo does bring more aggression to the team because both of these players are really aggressive, especially Bwibo as a top laner where, I mean, when he's in the game, something is going to happen. He was crazy aggro as a jungler last year as well. So even if he's a jungler, he's still, going to make things happen. But I think they're just so stable and solid across the entire board. And especially now that Bjergsen has had more time to ramp up as a player, I think by the time playoffs come around, when he comes fully online and starts taking over lanes, which I expect him to do, they're going to be really scary to deal with. I do think C9 is an interesting team because they have players that are so skilled individually. I think Summit has been really amazing in the top lane, the split. Blabber has had huge carry performances. The rest of them have had moments where they really shine as well. And now, without LS, you could say they're not as interesting because they're mostly playing meta stuff like the rest of the team. It's not as spicy, but they seem really confident in all those picks and they're doing it really well. So I think C9 would have to rely slightly more on the individual skill than Team Liquid, because I think Team Liquid is just really stable, really cohesive. C9, a bit harder to say, what they're going to show on the day, I feel like, partly because they're more aggressive in my opinion. But could go either way with TL being the slight favorite currently.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Oh yeah,
So both of you, if that's cool. If right now, you were to build a League of Legends team and you had to choose between best mechanics or best macro, and say one is 100%, one is 70%, right? So you get the other metric in your team. Yeah, comparable still, right? Would you go best mechanics or would you go best macro for your 5 players? You have to pick the same thing for all 5 players.
I would say, so in the past, I would say you always go mechanics because the idea is that you could teach macro. It sounds like, though, in the current iteration of the game and game design, because comeback mechanics are so ingrained with the bounty system, and that it's easy to slingshot people to 3-item breakpoints where you're truly in a late game and everyone has core build, that I would actually just prioritize team fighting. And if I was creating a team, I would just go in with people who were good at communication and all they needed to do was team fight and know when to team fight. And I don't know if that fits in like the macro bucket or the mechanics bucket, which is, I guess, a bit of a platitude, like cop-out answer.
Well, I think for macro, I was thinking more about playing the map well enough to get to team fights, right? Because that was where my head was when I said macro, so I probably used the wrong word there. But I'm on the same wavelength as you, where I would agree that team fight just seems to be strong. If you get someone that lanes serviceably, but team fights really well and plays late game really well, that just seems better to me.
Examples of kind of like this problem was when Origin used to exist, and we had Alphari as the top laner for Origin, and no one would ever disagree that Alphari was an incredible player. But one of the biggest issues that Origin had was how to integrate Alphari into team fights, and specifically him picking the right moments to team fight, them setting up the correct team fight in terms of where they were fighting and just their generalized execution. And even though Alphari was so good individually, if you actually watched him in the team fights and in talking with their coaching staff, it was a really big issue. And, that's not to say that Alphari can't team fight. It's to be, a team can create that atmosphere and everyone knows the responsibility. So maybe Alphari is a better team fighter for X team than Origin was. But it's like these small little things that people don't always take into account. And again, it's just players getting generalized. This player is bad at this player is good at this. But when you put them on a team, as Broxah said, like he had completely different responsibilities when he was playing for Fnatic versus when he was playing for TL. And I think that that's something that never really gets talked about. So if I was to create a team right now in the current meta, I'm like, team fighters. I'm looking for good comms, people who understand what the responsibility is, people who are willing to be facilitating players, and we're just gonna deathball this bad boy.
I would kind of go with the same thing. I think I would pick macro any day of the week, and I would do exactly what Frosk just said, where actually one of the points I kept bringing up on the LEC analyst desk that I said I would like to see from a lot of the teams, because I think most of the teams in the LEC have been so inconsistent, would be to just pick really simple, easy to execute deathball comps. Because with a lot of these comps, you don't rely that much on mechanics like big individual outplays. As long as you're in the right place at the right time and you have good team play, then the game is pretty straightforward. And yeah, I just think if you're a good macro, you can get away with so much right now. Obviously, the mechanics have to be at a certain level, but all pro players have been challenger for a lot of years, so their mechanics are already up there, right? You don't necessarily have to be Faker in his prime to to compete mechanically these days.
And that's why I picked TL over C9.
Well, speaking of which, TL and C9 are playing this weekend as we kind of like look forward. Now, I believe that this episode will air on the Monday following that, so the results will already be in. And just to reiterate, both of you guys are picking TL.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think 60-40 TL for me.
Okay, well, flame them accordingly if they are wrong. I also wanted to pick kind of games to avoid, not to trash anyone, but just this idea that we have only a limited amount of time. Now as more of a casual spectator of LoL Esports, where I don't have to be responsible for watching every single game, there are certain games that I choose to avoid. So let's keep it easy. What is your must-watch playoff series coming up for LEC, and maybe you could skip this one?
You want to go first, Broxah?
I see, Broxah, he's always making you go first, so you tank the aggro there. Don't fall for the game.
Yeah,
Make
exactly,
him
right?
go first.
You be my supportive jungler, tank for a little bit, I'll come in.
Broxah says something, Medic's like, yes, this is a good point.
I agree with Broxah. However, let me just build on his point, as I've thought of something for 5 minutes.
Well, it's fine. I'll have some time to think of my revenge for the next episode, I guess. So we'll be good. But I'm actually looking the most forward to, probably a bit surprising, but the loser bracket matchup in the LEC, Vitality versus Excel, because I don't know. I just think those loser bracket matchups are so much hype. There's so much on the line. I think when playoffs was the most hype, it was when you play a match and if you lose, you're just knocked out. I mean, it kind of sucked when you did get knocked out as a player, right? But there's so much hype involved, and as I said, my dark horse for playoffs will be Vitality. I feel like I have a pretty decent idea of what Fnatic and G2 are gonna bring. Obviously, they're gonna face each other as well, so that's gonna be pretty intense and exciting. But I just can't wait to watch Vitality right now, because I have no idea what's gonna come out of them, how they're gonna perform. Excel also first time in playoffs. Same thing. I don't know what's about to happen in that matchup, and I feel like for the two other matchups, I have like a pretty clear favorite in Fnatic on one side, Rogue on the other, and then I see Vitality Misfits or Vitality Excel. Sorry, I have no idea what's gonna go down in that matchup. Like, is this gonna be a 3-0 for one team? Is it gonna be 5 games? Who knows?
We have these lollies in the US called dum-dums. Do you guys have that in Europe? Well, the idea is that they have like set flavors. For people who are just listening, they both shook their heads no. The idea is set flavors.
Very confused.
They get melted down into a mystery flavor that you can get, and those ones are always the best. And that's how I've just like been thinking about Brox's explanation of Excel versus Vitality, that it's this sucker, this lollipop that is a mystery flavor, and usually they're the best ones. You just have no idea what you're going to get.
We could also just get Vitality stomping XL 3-0 in 3 20-minute games.
Or the opposite. Or the opposite, yeah.
Very true. By the process of elimination, though, don't watch Rogue versus Misfits. Apparently, that's going to be our most boring playoffs match of the weekend. Also, I'm not casting it, so is there really much point watching that? I think it's Vedi plus someone. Yeah, come on. It's not as exciting.
I guess.
On a serious note, I think that's the least fun series we have, because it should just go pretty easily to Rogue. Even though they are unpredictable in playoffs or consistently underperform in playoffs against Misfits, they should quite easily have their opponent's number.
Whoa, I feel like going into that you guys were really strong on the Misfits hype train, and now suddenly you
I
just
feel
made
like
Rogue?
I feel like Medic sold Misfits pretty well too. I'm actually a bit
So
surprised
here's
about
the
this one
thing.
as well.
I love Misfits. I just think they match up really poorly into Rogue, right? Because I don't think Rogue let VTO get ahead, right? And I don't think Rogue have enough issues between, say, 15 and 25 minutes to let Misfits get back in the game. Rogue have had a strong early game through Malrang a lot of the time in the regular season. And so they'll probably have, a 1.5, 2k gold lead at the 14-minute mark. And then what Rogue do really well is just accelerate that away from the enemy team. They take away all the camps, they take away all the neutrals, they take away all your towers, and they don't really give you much back. Where Misfits thrives is when the enemy team makes a mistake doing that, they pounce, they get a few team fights, they get a few wins, right? Rogue
Is this
don't tend to
through
make mistakes through like the
VTO's
textbook.
agency?
Yeah, VTO's agency. Schlatan's been really good at finding picks as well. His Lee Sin in particular, very strong at like finding someone mispositioned around an objective setup. Hirit sometimes can like counter TP flank into a fight as well, but a lot of the time it's on VTO and Schlatan to find picks. And I
Been
don't
VTO's
think
most successful
they'll
champion.
find it. Most successful or like signature? Because
Let's
signature
say-
is definitely a Kali.
Okay.
Like him on Akali is a sight to behold. But I don't know what I count as his most successful champion.
'Cause-
I'd have to.
The reason why I'm asking is I'm trying to decipher Misfits playstyle and like falling back on old school League knowledge. And so if you're saying Misfits excel off of agency plays that VTO makes, so he must have a champion, or probably his top champions, I'm assuming, either have really high kill pressure, especially in lane phase, that probably don't have to rely on scaling itemization, and then also probably have a form of CC. So I was thinking either Akali and Twisted Fate. And if someone's playing Lee Sin, I'm like, oh, they could be a probably strong Lee Sin Twisted Fate combination. Are they ganking a lot in lane, or is this just about picks and catches in river using Destiny?
So he actually doesn't play many of those global champs.
doesn't?
No,
And they
it's
still win all of their games?
well, they don't win all of their games. They lose a lot of their games, and often they're really far behind in the early game, which is their weakness. And they're really strong at finding like fights where the enemy team overextends. Like the G2 one is a great example. G2 just forced too many times looking for an extra inhibitor, looking for the Nexus, and can't quite find it. And then VTO suddenly is 3,000 gold ahead, 3 item Akali, and it's just destroying your team. So
he does have to rely on his itemization.
yes.
Do they just like sit tight until VTO's ready to fight, and then suddenly he just kills 2 people for 1, and then suddenly they win a big team fight that swings it?
I mean, often it's the enemy team makes a mistake and overextends into them. So it would be like
You're
an
not
odd
selling
numbers
Misfits for
fight.
me anymore. I was so
I,
I
love them as a team, but they're not great at making their own advantages. They can find picks, like in the early game at least. Like they're not great at finding a lead through the textbook of League of Legends, which is where Rogue really shine. Right, Rogue are great at playing by page to page, saying this is what we do next, this is what we do next, this is where Malrang will be in the early game, this is what we do, and then when we get to 14 minutes and we're ahead, this is how we close out a game. Where Misfits thrive is, okay, we're slightly behind in the early game, but the enemy team will make a mistake at some point and then we'll pounce. But against Rogue, they just don't really make too many mistakes. So it's like, how do Misfits win this series unless they find something new to do? And I'm just not sure how they do it. Which is why I'm not that excited for that playoffs match.
I've completely left the Misfits hype train. I don't know how deep you guys want to go into this, because I know, Broxah, you were just like, solo queue. No, don't want to discuss it being haunted. We do have our kind of hot takes. There's a lot of conversation right now, in particular from a quote from Faker. I'm sure you guys have seen it. If you haven't seen it, I will give the audience the TLDR. Faker came out pretty publicly and was exhibiting frustrations with high-level solo queue in particular, talking about other pros, particularly from the LPL, that come onto the Korean server, int his game, make it very frustrating. This is also in a conversation with, there was a lot of betting sites that were betting on Faker to lose, so this poor man has been griefed for a very long portion of his career, and this wider conversation about the health of solo queue, especially in the top level 4 pros. I guess I'll lean more on Broxah here, unless Medic, you have anything.
Oh no,
to add to that?
I think my experiences, in Diamond foremost years and this year finally getting Masters definitely apply to all pro players as well. So no, I think lean on Broxah is probably a good idea.
So when we talk about health of solo queue, Broxah, what does a healthy solo queue for a pro player look like?
So I would say a dream solo queue for me would be a solo queue where you queue up and you get to test different matchups. You get to, like, the main difference between scrims and solo queue is that when you play scrims, it's all about playing as a team. You communicate with your team. You have to facilitate. You have to help each other. You have to play the macro game. When you queue up for solo queue, it's all about your individual performance. Setting yourself up for success, trying different matchups, and just being the carry. I think most pros go into solo queue with the mindset that now you have to 1v9 the game, just get the carry pants on and get to work. And in an ideal world, all teammates in solo queue would go into the game with the same mindset, just be really serious, try hard. Obviously, there's always going to be people testing matchups. That's the case in scrims as well, which means that sometimes there's going to be lanes where things get a little out of hand and it gets a bit crazy. But I do also think that on pretty much all servers that I've played on, it's pretty frequent where you have someone who just, eventually doesn't want to play the game anymore. The person dies twice, they go AFK, or they start typing a lot of mean things in chat. And obviously Faker is a special case because I'm sure he's been dealing with a lot of these negative things more than anyone else, more than I will even be able to understand or comprehend. So I feel for him, but I think it's safe to say that solo queue, I don't know, it's just a really strange place, I feel like, because it doesn't really mirror scrims that much. It's just too different, it's just too crazy. And I think in scrims, if you have one guy who has a bad game, that guy is just going to play safe. The rest of the guys are going to step up to carry. If you have one guy who has a bad game, that guy is going to get so tilted out of his mind that he's going to ruin the game for everyone else. Sometimes it's just someone having a bad game and getting tilted. Sometimes it's someone griefing, which is what has happened to Faker so much. And I think the problem is that, when you play in lower elos, you don't really... I mean, if you're a silver player out there, I'm sure you also have, high expectations for your teammates, and you get frustrated if someone ruins your game.
Only the highest.
but I feel like when you reach a certain point, like let's say Master, Grandmaster, Challenger, I don't think that dynamic with how people behave and the way they treat the game really changes. I think in terms of mental state and how random solo queue players approach the game, sometimes even pro players, they don't care if they ruin the game for 4 other people. And I think in that sense, there could easily be more accountability to make solo queue more productive and more enjoyable for everyone. Because I think it has become a place where everyone's so careless and kind of selfish, where you don't care about if you ruin the game for 4 other people. If you are behind, you just run it down. That's kind of how it feels sometimes. And I think I had the same experience when playing on NA the past 2 years, but now NA has tried something a little different now, introducing Champions Queue, which is supposed to be the solution to that problem, right? Because then you're creating a queue system where you make sure that all people who are part of this queue actually are going to be held accountable. They're going to try hard. They're going to behave well. There's like certain standards that all these players have to live up to even get into champion queue and to then stay there. Whereas in solo queue, you can do you can't do whatever you want, but almost whatever you want, as long as you don't type mean things in chat, and then you're not going to get punished. And that's something that I'm sure a lot of pro players have been frustrated by. I know especially when I was in NA, it's something players talked about a lot more than in EU, because not only was the game quality a little iffy and frustrating, but then you also often had to wait 20 minutes in a queue to get into that game, and you were playing on 60 ping, so there were like a lot of layers on top, right? But I think it mostly comes down to like lack of punishment, lack of accountability more than anything.
I guess my first kind of follow-up to that is this idea of, it seems easy as a solution to suggest that there should be manual moderation for the highest level of League of Legends, but it's really hard for I think us as an audience to comprehend kind of what those hours look like. Is this Riot hiring 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people? What do you pay those people? And then it's up to the discretion if it is individual moderation, and then a definitive definition of what does griefing entail. You know what I mean? It's very easy to ban around absolutes like hate speech or mean things in chat, but it is much harder to ban around griefing of this guy's running it down unless he's like actually ghosting down mid lane.
Definitely.
And
And
I understand the frustration, but I'm actually just really curious what Riot can do that doesn't open up a whole nother can of worms of how can you ban me from this? I was just having a bad day. I was just testing out a matchup.
well,
What?
that's the tricky part, right? And I think that's why it has gotten to the point where it's at now, where a lot of people are frustrated. I actually talked about this on my stream earlier today for a long time, because I had so many viewers who were complaining about. I mean, it's because of why we're talking about it right now as well. The Faker conversation has kind of opened up the can of worms a little bit already. I feel like everyone's talking about it, and I had people from like all elos share their frustrations with me, and I think the main problem right now is that the system is mostly automatic, which means that it's just so hard to get banned unless you go like 0-20, or unless you type a lot of things that the system can notice are toxic and therefore get automatically suspended for offensive language or whatever. And I think in my mind, and again, like you said, it's impossible to really fully comprehend how easy it is to fix, but in my mind, I think for Challenger at the very least, it would be good if you had a couple of people who could manually look at some of the more extreme cases, or if you have certain people who are being reported a high percentage, then you could have like a deeper look at their games, what is actually going on. Because sometimes people are kind of sneaky about the way they ruin the games. It could be someone instead of just standing
very passive aggressive in chat, like just trying to help, guys.
Yeah, not even that.
Like soft hinting's super easy as well, right? Like
yeah,
you see a team play about I got caught placing a ward. Oh no.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes people just, someone can spawn, they could just run into 5 people and die on purpose. People are very sneaky nowadays about how they AFK as well. You're not gonna see someone go AFK like they did like 10 years ago, where they just stand in base and they get, the leave or penalty thing. Nowadays, they stand AFK for a minute somewhere, then they move to another spot for a minute, and they just keep moving around the map, so the system doesn't detect that they were AFK, and therefore they don't get punished. But in some of these cases, not all, but some, and obviously only the obvious ones would be the ones that you should punish, because people can have a bad day. But in some of them, I feel like if someone looked over a couple of the replays, it would be pretty obvious what's going on. And it would be more of an excessive case. And I think in this case, some of these excessive cases don't get punished, which is why someone like Faker is so frustrated about it that he vocally speaks about it and gets the entire league community and the entire world to speak about this now, because it's just gotten out of hand. And it's a tricky one to fix, because I think, you could hire a couple of people to manually look at it, but at the same time, I don't really know what exactly, or like how exactly they could approach it in like an efficient way.
Which is why I think automation has always been the kind of like the go-to, and so I'm wondering if this is going to be Riot perhaps maybe retooling, like you say, ban percentages. Maybe we're looking at a world where people are only given weight to so many reports that they make, and then if you are reported several times, maybe they retool where they're like moving that number of reports down before disciplinary action comes in. And it's just I don't know. I feel like I see a lot of frustration around it. And obviously in playing the game for many years, like can attest to bad attitudes. But it's also really interesting that to me at least, that a lot of the blame is falling on Riot to do something to such a nebulous problem, as opposed to the community looking around and being like,
this is what I would like to touch on, if you don't mind me interrupting here, because I have spoken so much I feel like the past 2-3 years about my frustrations with the community and like what we actually accept in this community as being okay, not only like in game, but just as much on social media, Reddit, whatever, wherever the communities really discusses anything with each other. Because I think there's just a tendency to like people being like really passive aggressive, toxic, obnoxious towards each other in solo queue because it's like an emotional and competitive moment that's obviously even more extreme. And I feel like whenever I've tried to open up this conversation, people just shut down my idea of like trying to change it, trying to bring some positivity and happiness and trying to be different, because they're like, sure, you can try to be different if you want, but you know, you're not even a 1%, so it's not going to change anything. And I think people have for some reason gotten to the point where instead of trying to be the difference, they've just kind of given up. And it's like using that as an easy excuse to be like everyone else, which I think is kind of a shame, right? Because let's say for Challenger in particular, in Challenger there's 300 people. If half of those people actually, you know, step it up and start behaving differently, then that's already going to be a massive difference. And then it's going to be a bit easier to shut down the rest. If, you know, if someone goes out of hand in game, everyone else can kind of protect each other and help each other, rather than just being full on every man for himself.
I'm in complete alignment with you, Broxah. I think that those are really great points. Just that we are really frustrated with a problem that ultimately we create because we're part of the culture and the community that do these things. And I think accountability is definitely something that needs to be retooled for the players that are on the widest spotlight. So if that's all of your challenger or grandmaster streamers, unfortunately, I think need to be held to higher standards, because if we think about, you know, if they're the biggest spotlight for how you behave, the pro players themselves, I know Faker specifically in this instance was complaining about the top laner for a professional team. I believe a disciplinary action has come out, but it's like the hammer has to hit very hard there before you start really changing the culture around what is acceptable. And this is no shade to Tyler One. I think, and personally in working with Tyler, he's been nothing but a very lovely human being. Which is very funny comparatively to like the persona. But even in that persona, the tweaking and evolution of how it's like changed to be almost like a parody of that toxicity as opposed to actually toxic, I think is, I don't know if it's like fair to say that there's like responsibility there, but it is something to consider as our primary source of interaction with League of Legends and the culture around it is first and foremost these streamers and then the pros themselves. Medic, I don't know
Definitely.
if you want to jump in on anything here.
And the only thing I was going to sort of bounce off is the idea that there is responsibility. Like in the same way that you have an obligation as a human to be, I can't say everyone has this obligation, but I believe morally we have obligations to be kind to other people, right? And to be a person that you would want to be around and to interact with people in a way that you'd want them to interact with you. And that extends into the internet. And anonymity obviously does a number on a lot of people, but the idea that you can just be a dick to people because they don't see your face is something that doesn't really fly with me. I know I've caught myself in it sometimes on stream, and like I'll never type to anyone else that I think they're playing really poorly or that I think they're really bad or anything, but you do. At least I find myself sometimes getting caught in the, oh, it was my teammate's fault, it was this person's fault, and making sure you break out of that and being like, hey, maybe it was your fault, but in the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It's one game, and like I can still be kind to you even if I think you made a mistake, because that's what I'd want you to be to me. I wouldn't want you flaming me because I made a mistake. I want you to be like, hey, I get it. You know, we all do. You're not expected to play perfectly every game, so let's try and win the rest of this one. It's something I love in Broxah's stream is always the, okay, yeah, the game's going poorly, but how do we fix this, or how do I fix this? What can I do to actually impact things? It's a good mantra to have instead of trying to place that blame outwards, because especially with solo queue, all you're trying to do is get better. The getting better is numbers going up on a screen, and maybe it's like getting to the next tier, but in essence, all that shows is that you're a better player than you were. And if you focus on the mistakes other people make, then you're not actually improving yourself at all. You're just hoping that your teammates are slightly better next game, so they get the benefit and you don't.
If you
But yeah.
prio the skill, the ELO will come.
Exactly. Or if you just play a lot of Rakan, apparently. That's how I got all of my ELOs. So.
No, thank you, gentlemen. As we kind of wrap up the episode, this is kind of the space where you get to do your own shout outs, where to find you, if there's any interesting content that you may not be making soon. Broxah, we can start with you.
Well, I'm a full-time streamer right now, so I can be found on Twitch almost daily. I can also be found around different places on the internet cheering for Team Liquid. Again, no bias, of course, towards this beautiful team right here, who I believe may or may not win the split. Very unbiased. But I know, just creating content, Twitch, YouTube, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I'm the same. Mostly Twitch streaming at the moment. I'm on Medic casts and then do the LEC every now and again, but we've got a little week break before we get back to that. So hopefully see you all around.
Good luck on that one, guys. Got a very busy schedule coming up. Reminder, guys, so this is a bi-weekly podcast. Next time that we go on the air, we will be focusing much more on the LCK and LPL. So plenty of time for us three to study up and get that Eastern League of Legends injected into our brain. But so far, thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a lovely rest of your day.
One thing. You forgot yourself. Where can we find you nowadays? What are you up to? I think that's something a lot of viewers are excited to hear.
I actually just chill and vibe now. I work for a comedic gaming television network called G4. You can find me at G4 TV. We stream basically every single day, and I play competitively in Pokemon Unite, which is baby's first League of Legends game. And I just stomp 6-year-old. It's great. Thank you guys so much. This has been Recall. Again, the next episode we will be going in depth for LCK and LPL and getting you guys everything you need to know in preparation for the upcoming playoffs and MSI. Until then, see you next time.